friends at the SES to introduce themselves and to start the presentation.
Yeah, thanks.
So that's the
That's the
controller. Yeah.
okay. So, yeah, okay, very good. Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to present you today, and we hadn't had much time coming into your session, but then having lunch and quickly greeting various people. Yeah, so I understand there's people from Western Sydney University, Dam Safety New South Wales, who we work very closely with, and a whole group from India, dam owners and dam engineers and so on. So yeah, welcome. Yeah, I hope you're having a good stay in Australia.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
And soaking up a lot of things. And I'm going to be talking about the State Emergency Service and what we do and our role in flooding and in dam emergencies and so forth. So we'll give a pretty big overview. To introduce myself, I'm Peter Craig, Senior Manager Emergency Risk Management. My background in SES, I've been 25 years on the staff, and before that, a volunteer, because we're largely a volunteer organisation with about, I think it's about 450 staff now, across the state, about 10,000 volunteers. So I'm wearing uniform today. I've got an operational background plus a planning background, so I straddle both those sides. And I head up a branch called Emergency Risk Management, which has resurrected again in the last couple of years after we had a couple of restructures, and it's now expanded. So to give you an idea, in 2018 it was about 10 people. In the last year or so we went to 15, and now we're up to about 28. So and I've got 4 teams, of which one team's represented here, the emergency planning team. Nick Custer is the Manager of Emergency Planning. Donna Reinhardt is Coordinator Planning in that team, and Vanessa Barnes is our Planning Research Officer in the team. And we'll be sharing the slides and what we talked about, so you get a bit of variety. And there'll be opportunities to ask questions, because I think you wanted to keep it interactive. So happy to ask questions on the way through. So that's the team. So I just might start.
I'll mention Craig too.
Oh, sorry, yes, I should have mentioned Craig Ronan, Planning Coordinator in the Western Zone. He's not able to make it here today. He's been working in a big way with Dam Safety New South Wales, in coordinating procedures and checklists and workshops and a whole range of things. He couldn't be here today because of operational activity in Western New South Wales, where it looked like there was going to be some flooding, and that subsided a bit, but they're demobilising from operations, so he couldn't be here today. So, but he would love to have been here. He would have been another good presenter. And the Dam Safety New South Wales people know Craig well.
Probably said it from the seminar. If you get to that seminar too, that's Craig Ronan. He also presented at NCOLF as well.
Yeah.
If you might recall, for those last year.
Yeah. And before going to the slide, maybe in their own words, maybe describe what they do. Yeah, just start with Nick.
Yeah, sure. Like Nick Custer, I work in Peter's team, and I'm the Manager of Emergency Planning. And so we're responsible for that statewide overview of our service for not just dam emergency planning or the flooding from dams, but also what's related to our combat role, which is floods, storm and tsunami. And Peter will probably just mention that briefly anyway. But it's all things in that prevention and preparedness for those 3 hazards. And yes, we work in a response agency, so we also stand up in that as usually as flood intelligence officers or flood analysts when we're operational. So when there's a lot of rain around or there's a lot of flooding around as well. So we do that statewide sort of overarching governance, look at state plans, mainly emergency planning. My background is on environmental science, Master's in Environmental Science, but again, we're very multidisciplinary as well. So I'll just throw these guys in the team.
So I'm one of the coordinators within our team. We've got 2 coordinators, and we've each got a small team underneath each of us. My team primarily focuses on a lot of issues to do with gauges and the flood gauge network. So we I do a lot of work with the Bureau of Meteorology and other state government agencies. I also, we're about to embark on a big body of work in the tsunami space, so focusing on some tsunami planning. And a lot, because we're a state-based team, we do a lot of work with the zones. We've got teams all out in different zones throughout the state, and we manage systems and set up set up systems and processes for different planning activities. So we sort of maintain all of that.
Yes, and then my role is a planning and research officer. So again, doing a lot of the background research and work for that, looking up the policies and guidelines and the doctrine and the legislation related to what we need to do. At my side of the team also look at those state plans. So there's a state flood plan, state tsunami plan, and state storm plan. And then following that, there's other branches of plans at more regional and local levels as well. So we help manage those as well. And we also work in the dam space. So again, as we said, dealing with Dam Safety New South Wales. So just trying to help influence where we can through them to the dam owners to then see how that can help us within an operational space, what information we need.
Okay, so yeah, there's part of the team. So you know, what go into the slides about the space bar.
Down arrow.
Down arrow. Okay.
Maybe not.
Always the fun part.
Well, look, we really appreciate being able to present to you how we do it in New South Wales and look at flooding, storm, tsunami in New South Wales.
Yeah, there we go.
Very privileged to present to you today.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you for that.
Righty, so yeah, and I might stand off to the side so I'm not obscuring this the screen. The overall mission of the SES is to save lives in creating safer communities. And our vision is a trusted volunteer-based emergency service working together to deliver excellence in community preparedness and emergency response. So that's from our strategic plan. We are a volunteer-based emergency rescue service established in 1955 after the devastating floods in New South Wales. There's sort of need to be an agency to coordinate across government agencies, the community for flood. So that's where we were born. We now what's called the combat agency, which is like a US term from the 1970s. A combat agency is an agency sort of combating the hazard, but we don't combat it. That's more about fire agencies. They fight the fire. We deal with the consequences. So that's the primary agency for storm, flood, and tsunami in New South Wales. Basically, all the wet disasters, not the red hot disasters. So we provide emergency assistance around the state 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. And we have a dedicated call centre, which expands and contracts, which takes in all the calls statewide and then farms it out to all our units, as we call them. We've got about 230 of those. We also provide the majority of rescue in rural areas in New South Wales. You may have noticed that the population in Australia is very much centred around the capital cities. And the state of New South Wales, 2/3 of the population lives in the Greater Sydney metropolitan area, and about 70% or a bit more along the coast. And then west of the Great Dividing Range, which runs through New South Wales, it's very rural. So outside the city metropolitan area, we do most of the rescue across the state. Road crash rescue, vertical rescue, all those type of things. And we work closely with the other emergency services organisations and their day-to-day functions. And they also provide assistance back to us. So some facts and figures about us. That's the state of New South Wales. The black lines here, they're our zones that we divide up the state for operational purposes. We've got Metro, Northern, Northeastern, Northwestern, southeastern, southern, and western. In the Great Dividing,
Okay.
touchscreen, the Great Dividing Range is around about here. And that's the main geographic feature. Most of the rivers on the coast flow from the Great Dividing Range down to the ocean. And then west of the Dividing Range, they drain into this extensive river system. And the Murray-Darling system is one big one, Murrumbidgee and other ones. This is much more sparsely populated country towns because of that great concentration in Sydney and the coast. And you can see, these zones cover huge areas. And these river systems can be relatively dry in drought, but they can be quite big flooding when it's wet, like it has been for the last few years. So that's where our floods last weeks, months. On the coast, they tend to last, days or weeks. So as I mentioned, the number of calls we take, we had 12 floods in the last year. Then the number of incidents or the jobs that get farmed out to incidents, about 47,000 of them. That was a busy year. And you can see the breakdown by state, the storm flood, vertical rescue, community first responder, which is like mini ambulances. That's where the New South Wales Ambulance Service can't cover areas. So we've got community first responder teams with some basic gear, and then back in ambulance resources from other areas. Road crash rescue, pretty common. General land rescue, all those things where people get fingers caught in industrial machines and all those other things. We're up to 498 salary staff. We've had a boost in the last year, about 180 staff. Got lots of vehicles. One notable thing about our vehicle fleet, we've got vehicle as a node technology now, so that when they're out there, instead of just having the radio system, they're out of range, they can go through satellite or mobile phone or the radio system. And that's pretty much completed across the state, including out west here where cell towers aren't as common. So there's a lot of them satellite based. So that's an overall picture of SES. It's busy. 10,919 volunteers and 498 staff. With planning, my branch, the emergency risk management branch, has got 4 teams that we've expanded into. Emergency risk assessment, which is about future risk, about future development. There's a constant development pressure because Australia has net migration in, and there's Sydney gets constrained because of the mountains and the rivers, and along the coast, more and more people are settling on the coast. So there's big pressure to develop in floodplains, and you would have seen it back in India and other places. It's always, there's always developers and councils and maybe some government departments. So they deal with that. And we try to limit the increase of risk, flood risk. Last year we had, after the floods, an independent flood inquiry convened by the government. And they, in their report, they talked about retreating from the floodplain as a principle. Now that's very hard to do. And to give you an idea, we've got about 250,000 properties up to the 1% or 1 in 100 flood, 1 in 100 chance per year, and about a similar number between 1% and the probable maximum flood of PMF. So below 1%, which was adopted back in the 1970s and 80s, in the US and here, we've got that lot of legacy development, but there's also pressure to develop there, and also between the 1% and PMF. And at the moment, if you had seen any of the headlines, there's constant discussion about the housing crisis, population pressures, immigration, all those factors. It's a swirling debate, often goes off in tangents. But the net result is there's development pressure. So this team is very much involved. That's expanded from 1 person to 8 people now. And that's where we liaise with the Department of Planning, Housing and Infrastructure. And also the Climate Change, Environment, Energy and Water. They've got new names in January. So that's a key thing, looking to the future. A warnings team, which we'll talk about later about the warnings we'll put out before and during events. Emergency planning team, you've already met, who deal with the emergency plans. And what they deal with is the residual risk. After everything's said and done, we've got a plan to deal the population, the dwellings, the terrain, the infrastructure as it is now, and we have to respond. Emergency risk analytics is a new team to build up more quantitative risk analysis to inform our various functions and the rest of the organisation. So that's up to 5 people. A lot of data sort of people. We use data analysis and Power BI and GIS and a whole range of things there. So that's a growing team. And a very important one, because then we can quantify across the state a lot better risk, because those who've been involved in risk analysis or risk assessment, it's often hard to get good hard data and to quantify the arguments, often complicated arguments about, should we build there or not? Should we put infrastructure there or not? And we've got another project called a flood visualisation project that we got funded for 2 years, which sort of fueled part of the risk analysis team. And that project finishes on the 30th of June. It was mentioned a couple of times, we've got planning teams based at each zone. So we've got 7 zones across the state, and we have 25 planners. Along the coastal ones, about 4 or 5 planners in each one. That's a lot more than we used to have. All of this team, plus that, was only 10 people. Combine that with the planning teams out there is 55. That's a big, huge boost that we built up in the last 18 months. And then we've got volunteer planners based at the units, the volunteer units, which there's 230 across the state. So we've got a bit of a tiered system of central teams, zone-based teams, and then working with volunteers who have an interest in planning. But the bulk of the representation with other agencies is by the zone teams and these teams, because they all happen during the day, and long, complicated meetings where you're watching grass grow. Long, complicated discussions. So that's a bit of a profile. We also extensively work with a whole range of partner agencies and stakeholders. Internally, geospatial intelligence, GIS, geographic information systems. That team's expanded up to 11. And we've got a lot of geospatial information through a flood data portal where councils and local councils and state government agencies can lodge their flood study data, and also Dam Safety New South Wales are lodging in there as well with the dam break studies. Community strategy and engagement, that's a very important one, because we can respond, we can plan, but this one is very much involved in changing people's behaviour. That's the hardest nut to crack of the ball, because it takes a long time to shift people from their preconceived ideas, frameworks, patterns of behaviour from the past to do things that are compatible with the strategies that we plan and respond to. And that's sort of expanding, maybe not expanding enough. That's the hardest one to fund with government agencies, governments, because everyone likes trucks and hardware and all those type of things. But that's absolutely key. That's a big frontier for us in the future. Externally, the Bureau of Meteorology, which in Australia is the weather forecasting service, they've got national responsibility for flood warning.
Peter, can I interrupt there? I think INCOIS is your equivalent agency. Is that right for the Bureau?
I am the India Meteorological Department.
There you go.
INCOIS is for the storm generation, cyclone and storm.
Okay.
INCOIS.
Yeah. So We have a good relationship with them, built up over the last couple of decades. They're very much partners and we interact on a daily, weekly basis. In fact, we have 2 bureau staff working full time. They work for the bureau, but they work in SES and they provide the weekly briefings and also the daily briefings when the weather's coming in to cause storms or flooding. Local government councils, because we've got a federal system, councils underneath state governments, underneath the federal government, a bit like the US, because our system of government's a bit of an amalgam of UK Westminster system and the US federal system. We kind of mixed and matched. State government agencies, we're one, Dam Safety New South Wales is another, and there's a whole range of them. Other state emergency service organisations around Australia, we have interstate assistance and dam owners as well.
You have 261 units. Is a unit a council or not?
No, that's a volunteer unit. And there's at least
There's
one
no
established in each local government area or council area. So the council does its all its normal
But
functions.
the boundaries are.
So we use that. In some cases, we subdivide a council area. Because what's happened in New South Wales, some councils are amalgamated. It's difficult for them to maintain their rate bases. Especially out Western New South Wales, with limited population. But in Sydney, we've got something like around 40 councils. In Sydney, we don't have one big super metropolitan council. That's historical. And there was a move by the government to merge some of those. And community pressure says, no, we want to unmerge some. It's a tricky area. Brisbane has got, I think, the only capital city in Australia that's got a Brisbane City Council. So we've got about 125 councils across New South Wales.
Sorry, some of those council areas require multiple units within that area to manage. And also they're going to often follow the river systems. So often the river systems will go over multiple council areas. So often our units will be more based strategically for the river system. So that's why there's going to be overlaps.
And our organisation, local government was seen as a level of government that we had to have a presence in. So that 3-level system can be a bit tricky to navigate. UK, for example, they have counties and the national government. New Zealand, it's one big national government. I think some councils. So 3 levels, it does cause jurisdictional boundaries, interest and funding issues. So we've got the paradigm for intelligence response, prevention, preparedness, response and recovery. A lot of that came from FEMA in the 1970s. It formulated that approach. Different nations have different paradigms. UK has a different paradigm and so on. But we do follow a lot of trends from the US. In the last 20 or 30 years, there's been a growing realisation that response and recovery aren't sequential processes. Happen in parallel as response, even as response peaks, there's initial recovery efforts, and then floods where you're flooding different areas and then it recedes at different pace, different parts of the river system. There's recovery coming in, so that these often operate in parallel, and we're responsible for the response. For the recovery, that's a changing beast at the moment. At the moment, the New South Wales Reconstruction Authority is responsible for managing recovery.
Oops, sorry.
Yeah.
Got that. There you go. Sorry,
Yeah.
I'm just getting rid of this.
I'll pop up.
There you
Yeah.
Just to understand that. I work for the World Bank and when we do emergency projects, 80-90% goes to recovery. Help people get back we put way too little money in prevention
Yes,
and preparedness. How is it? in your-
similar,
The same.
similar here. And yeah, there's a,
So we're not really working on development, we're just responding to needs.
yeah,
Exactly, it's a real issue because,
Yeah.
you know, we really do advocate for our other agencies like the Floodplain Management Association and what have you, that in governments that need to spend more money in that prevention space here. And land use planning and you also don't develop on that, in the first place, but it's very hard for that existing risk. In those, places that are already there and those communities that are already there. Very, very difficult to see how we might be able to deal with that, but it's absolutely noted, you know,
Yeah.
too much is spent on recovery, not enough in this space here.
And the new dam safety act, of course, talks much more about risk-based than what we learned
Yeah.
this morning.
Yeah.
That is a change, a good change already towards the left, yeah.
And the last 3 years of the major flooding that we've had, I think he's helping change that perception and recognition that we need to do the prevention.
yeah. And that's been identified, you know, there's a federal government agency called the Productivity Commission that did a study several years ago, identified that pattern, yeah, it's well known. But it can be difficult to shift some of the expenditure into prevention and mitigation. Over the last 30 years, yeah, water agencies have realised, you know, that engineering solutions aren't always the best solutions, building dams, changing river courses, dredging rivers and all that type of thing. Because people, you know, rivers are like the lifeblood of many areas. And I think these days it's more adapt to the river system than to engineer it. And I think you've been all aware of major dam proposals, and in the Western world, dam building has really decreased in the last few decades. And so it's much harder to do that. There's been talk of, for example, Warragamba Dam, Sydney, raising the dam wall by 14 metres to provide airspace. That got knocked on the head by the incoming state government because of upstream environmental effects, because it's a World Heritage Area. Effects on the water supply, you know, if you lower the full supply level. So you've got to balance up water supply, upstream and downstream effects plus flooding. So it's like a triple or quadruple optimization problem that's very hard to solve. And these days, environmental concerns are uppermost, and also in that one particular dam, Aboriginal, you know, First Nations people value is there. It's really complex. A previous national government, which was Liberal National Party, they were talking about building some dams out west. They've been knocked on the head. Because, you know, they provide some solutions, but they can introduce problems. It's a very delicate balancing act. So major engineering work about mitigation, we're not really in favour of things like levees, because we have what's called a levee paradox. You build a levee up to a certain protection level, then it goes over, pops it, provides a false sense of security. If it encircles an area, then it tips in and there's not much time to evacuate. So levees try to reduce property damage up to a point, and usually up to 1 in 10 or 1 in 20, rarely up to 1 in 100. And we've had places like Lismore up north, people watching the levee, and they don't want to evacuate, but they should, because they'll eventually go overtopped. Because you can't build a levee high enough for up to the probable maximum flood. And that's a principle we have, is we don't cut off the risk at an arbitrary level and just deal with most frequent. We plan up to the probable maximum flood, so that, you know, we don't get subject to the idea of it's unprecedented, we didn't expect it, it's beyond our imagination. You know, it is within our imagination.
And sea level rise, of course, and climate change is going to be even exacerbate a lot of that.
Yeah.
Those problems already. So, you know, even more.
Yeah.
And us as an agency have to be across that. And that's going to be
Yeah.
a difficulty on one hand, but for us, because so we do plan to that probable maximum flood.
Yeah.
So it almost doesn't matter. We should be still have those plans And that preparedness, up to that level anyway.
Yeah.
Might happen more frequently or,
Yeah.
more intense rainfall. That kind of stuff.
So I'm not sure if we're going to cover it, but how do you account for that uncertainty in your planning?
Well, we have to have plans that have contingencies for that uncertainty. And often when there's rain around or what have you, we'll actually plan to that level first. So you plan to the worst case scenarios.
Yeah.
And until we're absolutely certain that that's not going to happen, then we can say, this is what it's actually. We don't work the other way around. Oh, it's only going to be go to 5 meters. On a particular gauge or something. Oh, no, it's going to get to 7 or 8. You look at it's going to get to 7 or 8 first, and then we'll go back from there.
Yeah.
Generally.
So in this, the flood planning, when we are talking about flood. So the flood forecasting or prediction, it is done by the Bureau of Meteorology and it's given to you.
Yes.
Yeah, that's right.
And if there are scenarios to be done, it is done by you, the dam manager, or how do you coordinate?
Well, we do like
Yeah.
consequence scenarios.
Mhm.
That's what
We've actually got a slide on that too.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've got a slide on that, but
Yeah.
just on that, the Bureau now has started to give ensemble
Yeah.
forecasting.
So-
And so scenario-based forecasting.
Yeah.
And nuanced
Yeah.
for emergency services. So
Yeah.
for us, we've got outlooks that show even getting down to sort of, very broad times on what a most likely scenario might be, or maybe a higher probable scenario. So we're starting to get more nuanced forecasting. That's not for the public realm, but it's for
But
us.
for
as
your own
emergency services,
planning process.
Yeah, for our own
Yeah.
planning.
Yeah.
That's in the R space. Yeah, good question.
Yeah, and as we go through, you'll see, we're going to talk about various aspects of this, but just very quickly, we're established under an Act of State Parliament, State Emergency Service Act. There's an overarching Emergency Management Act across all the agencies, the State Emergency Rescue Management Act. 1989 was a big year. A lot of it was rationalised, rescue arrangements, things got settled down a fair bit. There's a state emergency management plan, which is like an multi-hazard plan, and then plans for each hazard. And we've got these first 4. The Hawke's Nepean Valley is such a big flood problem, it's its own state level plan. And these are the 4 plans where we set out the statewide arrangements of who does what, the overall risk. And then we do local flood plans, local flood emergency sub-plans, which deal with that for the local government area. So that's the planning framework.
Again, just coming to this plan, because
Yeah.
we are doing the dam and we are having the similar issue is flood management plans are there in India, it is done by the Water Resource Department. So now comes the dam break. So is dam break part of the flood management planning, or
Yes.
is the emergency action plan a subset of that, or how it has been done?
Absolutely, and we've got some slides on how that links in, because in here, these local emergency sub-plans here, if the dam is got a lot of issues about it, we'll actually have a specific area in the plan that discusses or that delineates the emergency response arrangements or the strategies and tactics for that particular dam. And we'll go into it too, but our GIS system has flood extents for those as well.
Yep.
We also keep databases of the dam emergency plans as well, which then point back to the local flood plans.
Yeah.
And we've also got those higher strategic level meetings as well. But we are across all the dam emergency plans in the state as well, working with Dam Safety New South Wales.
Yeah.
So it's absolutely, it's linked like that.
Yes.
And that's how, that's very much a reflection of how emergency management works in our state of New South Wales is, like agencies have their responsibilities, such as Dam Safety New South Wales, SES, the fire agents as well, but we'll work together, and that's what the overarching end plan says we'll do. Is that where it is, third point, that's it. This end plan then brings it all together, for all the agencies must work together through a coordinated effort from the senior emergency management area in the state, which are usually generally senior police officers.
So here, just for me to understand, you don't have separate dam emergency action plans, they are incorporated.
Oh, no,
We do.
Do.
those plans exist for
Yeah.
the
And
dam
then-
itself, managing the dam
Then
itself.
you summarize them in your emergency supplement.
Yes.
Well, we summarise the
And you'll-
consequences
It
of
is
that dam break.
incorporated in that.
That's right, the
Yeah.
consequences, because that's what
Yeah.
we're interested in. We're interested in the flooding from
Yeah.
those
Yeah.
dams. So, which we'll explain. We've got a couple of slides in that as well.
Yeah.
So.
So the flood emergency plans cover floods from whatever source, rivers, dams, storm surge, and to a certain extent tsunami. Now we've got a separate plan for that. So we've got a very broad flood definition. So the way Dam Safety New South Wales manages the dam owners to manage their dams, for the to help protect the dam itself and the upstream effects, but downstream, it's the State Emergency Service responsibility.
And you're asking about, sometimes there might be releases from the dam either voluntarily or not. That's usually a participative, coordinated effort via some kind of meeting or a
Yeah.
committee, generally with operational staff as well. You go in there, okay, if they release this much or this spills or what have you, what's the effect on the dam? But also the Bureau will then predict the height downstream for the community impacts. Is it going to be minor, moderate or major flooding as well? So we might say in those meetings, look, it's going to get to major flooding. That's going to be a real issue for our communities. Is there a way to release it slower and those kind of things?
Yeah.
What have you? But they need to protect the structure as well. So
Yeah.
it's coordinated response.
With all those flooding types and even with the dam emergencies, there's a range of events that can happen at a dam, especially gated dams like Warragamba Dam, where there's radial gates and a main drum gate. For example, a few years ago, 6-7 years ago, there was a faulty sensor on one of the radial gates and it just started lifting and letting out water. And the Bureau, it was Sydney Catchment Authority at the time. They rang us up, they were very nervous, said, look, it's lifting, we don't know why. It was actually catered for in the plan that various scenarios of 1, 2, 3 or 4 radial gates opening just through a sensor failure. Or if the drum gate comes down, and including scenarios like sunny day dam break, like an earthquake and the dam forks out. They're extremely rare, thank God. But yeah, there's a range of dam events, and the dam emergency plans really do a lot of study to work out what are the different column failure modes of the dam and to what extent. And sometimes those events can cause flooding on a slightly faster time frame than normal, or in case of a dam break, very sudden. So the speed of the onset of the flooding can be variable of the dam events. But luckily, because we've got such good regulation, it's more parked into, from nearly all dams, I think more in the 1 in 100,000 to 1 in a million chance. Though we do have variants of that, with retention basins, which are classed as dams, and others which can fill up to a certain point. But most of the big dams are identified early, and there might be some remedial works being done on particular dams. And I know Warragamba Dam, because it provides water for 80% of the water for Sydney. They've done very extensive modelling, including up to earthquake, which is fairly rare there. And it's a big dam, 3 million tonnes. It's hard for it to collapse. But before it got raised in the 1980s, the probable maximum flood estimates were varied upwards, across the world. Back in the 1950s, the dam opened in 1960. It was designed for a particular PMF. In the mid-1980s, the PMF was twice the volume, and there was a real fear that in a big enough flood, you would get crumbling of the top wall. And there were remedial works like putting big bolts in to make sure that unfurling didn't happen. And there's been subsequent work, an auxiliary spillway to protect it and so on, because that was such an important one. But as time goes on, that some of the dams were built 100 years ago, or 50 years ago, or 30 years ago, things can change, so it's a constant watch. Now, the risk does evolve with time. And over the next 50, 100 years, I'm sure there's going to be some interesting studies and problems with dams, because we're getting to the stage where you're seeing a lot of these structures are getting old. Same with bridges and roads and everything else. Now, one way to separate, because we're going to talk about the prediction side afterwards, but we can actually map out the consequence to a fair degree by the geographic constraints. And it floods an area, most areas are flat. If we take riverine flooding, it will back up along creeks, backwater flooding. That means areas can be surrounded and isolated, because there's usually a big network of creeks that feed into a river system. So what we do is we have a classification scheme for the areas where we identify these type of areas: high flood island, where it gets surrounded, but the largest flooded means there's part of it above. A low flood island where it's surrounded and eventually gets submerged. High trap perimeter, low trap perimeter, a lot of variants of those, where part of the constraint you're backing onto the higher cliffs or mountains or large hills. Overland escape route, the road gets cut, but you could possibly walk out, which is not ideal. Rising road access, where it just comes up the hill and you move away from it. And then a lot of areas, like we have in the Hawke's and the Pan, for example, the other side of the river, it can become isolated. It's not flooded, but it's isolated because there's limited roads across the Blue Mountains. So we use that, and we look at the road network, because the main means of evacuation is via vehicle, because we've got very high vehicle ownership. So pedestrian evacuation is pretty rare in Australia. So it's by vehicle. And so you look at the roads, where do the roads get cut? Because often roads level, they dip down into the creeks and the crossings. Occasionally the bridges, but bridges aren't built for low levels of flooding. So we look at the access. That helps define this. So we've got a number of the next one, a number of factors that we take into account. The river and creek lines, the backup flooding, the flood extents from flood studies and dam break studies, road closure points, historical flood behaviour, infrastructure barriers like a railway line. If it doesn't have any railway crossings, that's a barrier, an access barrier. And other access considerations, like the housing estate, there's only one road out, and the only way, if you can't drive out, then you have to jump fences, which in today's society is not something people do much. And suburb boundaries and evacuation routes. Put all those together, and we have a mosaic of those different type of areas, and we can put trigger heights on which a strategy has to be adopted. Usually it's evacuation to get away from the hazard before the water hits. But in some areas, if they're in a really low flood island and the power lines still come in, they've still got water, like some country towns, they'll be isolated because they can still function as a community up to a point. In the bigger levels of flooding, of course, they flood in. We've had several examples of that. But we can map out, and we have been, for the metropolitan area now across a fair portion of the state, we've mapped out all those areas and finalising trigger heights. And what that means is we know the heights at which things have to be completed by, evacuation, isolation, whatever. So we've got, in effect, a growing list. The key variable then is how much warning timeframe. What we don't know in advance is when it's going to be cut. That's where the forecasts come in. So by doing that geographic analysis of all those factors, we can identify all the risk areas. The time evolution of the flood, that's got to be left to response, because floods can evolve at different speeds depending, especially when you have multi-river ones. And so we may be, evacuating faster or slower, because we have like the Hawke's Nepean River system, it's encircling Sydney, several rivers, and the hydrograph can rise, flatten out, rise, flatten out in various scenarios because of the interaction. So we're doing it across the state, so we know what to evacuate and this is what some of them look like, and this is some newer ones down on the south coast. You can see the evacuation routes. The purple lines are what we call these areas subsectors. Sectors are operational areas of control. Subsectors are the problems they focus on within each sector. So we should have that by the end of the year, most of New South Wales, with known flood studies mapped out. And that reduces the problem of trying to work out where do we have to evacuate people from and at what height. Go to the next one. And that's where it comes into the flood warning system, which I'll start off and then Donna will continue. We've got various flood gauge network, a flood gauge network across New South Wales, maintained by a number of state agencies. There is no one agency that owns all the gauges. There are flood classifications like minor, moderate, and major, which are sort of like average consequence descriptors, not useful for us, maybe useful for the public. And then there's various warning products, and that's where the Bureau predicts for particular points when it's going to flood. And yeah, that's the gauge network. There's lots of them, and there's a big project at the moment along the coast to upgrade some gauges. It's a fairly robust network for riverine flooding. Yeah, so that's continues to evolve. And I mentioned those minor and moderate and major, which are historic ones. They're very average. Minor might be minor inconvenience, moderate, a bridge might be out and so forth. We're going finer than that in our flood area classification. And we'll go into that in the video, but just picking it into flood forecasting, the Bureau uses what they call deterministic models based on the global weather models and local models. They have 8 of those. Ensemble forecasting, they pick what they think is the best one, because there's forecasting skill. Models can only take you so far. There needs to be forecasting skills to do that. And there's been examples like in Victoria using consultants who do flood studies over a period of months coming in to try and forecast, and they're off the mark because they don't have that forecasting skill of translating a flood study into real forecasting with real inputs. But it's becoming more quantitative, and for the Hawke's Nepean, we're about to launch a product called a probabilistic flood forecast model, where it takes those 8 models plus about 32 Monte Carlo simulations to come up with a range of possible outcomes. So it's probabilistic. There's a distribution of heights and there's distribution of times. That's a more complex product. That's not for the public. Its main value is up to where the Bureau forecast now. And I'll pick the location here, Windsor and Hawke's Nepean. 15 hours ahead, reasonable accuracy. If you try and look further ahead, that's where all the scenarios can start to diverge a bit. The value of the product is what if in 24 or 36 hours ahead, what is the likely or range of evolution of flood heights and so on. But the decisions will be based on the shorter warning products. So probabilistic forecasting is a new frontier for us and for the Bureau. And the idea is to try and extend it around the state. So we have to do that to, well, I suppose collectively we have to build up our forecasting skill using that product. And I know there's been papers published around the world about the pros and cons of probabilistic versus deterministic forecasts. And probabilistic ones to an audience, emergency service audience, emergency services love to control things and certainty, finality, do something. But when we say it could be between plus or minus 2 meters, that can make some of the emergency management committee uncomfortable because we're still grappling with uncertainty. In fact, the whole society grapples with that problem day to day, like interest rates and everything else. There's always an uncertainty range, and that scares people because they want a number. That's why using it is going to be an interesting exercise. So I might pause there and we'll show a video about understanding flood classifications.
If you live in a flood-prone area, it's important to know your risk and to understand how severe a flood is likely to be. Riverine floods typically occur 6 or more hours after heavy rainfall. In Australia, we have 3 riverine flood classifications: minor, moderate, and major. Minor flooding refers to inundation of low-lying areas next to watercourses. Minor roads may be closed and low-level bridges submerged. In urban areas, inundation may affect some backyards and buildings below the floor level, as well as bicycle and pedestrian paths. For moderate flooding, the area of inundation is more substantial. Main traffic routes may be covered and some buildings may be affected above floor level. Evacuation of flood-affected areas and removal of stock may be required. Finally, major flooding can be very dangerous and may result in extensive inundation of rural and urban areas. Properties and towns are likely to be isolated, and major traffic routes and rail routes are likely to be closed. Evacuation of people from flood-affected areas may be required and utility services may be impacted. The Bureau produces warnings and advice to local communities who are experiencing or at risk of experiencing riverine flooding. Flood watchers provide early advice of a developing situation that may lead to flooding, while flood warnings are issued when floods are likely to occur or are already occurring. Sometimes short bursts of heavy rainfall can lead to rapid onset flooding, known as flash flooding. When this is likely to occur, the Bureau will issue a severe weather warning for heavy rain that may lead to flash flooding. Current flood watches and warnings, as well as severe weather warnings, can be found on our warnings page or the BOM Weather app. You can also access rainfall and river level data for around 3,500 locations across Australia. Sadly, fatalities are common around floodwaters. Just 15 centimetres of water is enough to make your car float. So remember, the best way for you to stay safe is to stay out of floodwaters and to follow advice from your local emergency services. For around 3,500 locations across Australia. Sadly, fatalities are common around floodwaters. Just 15 centimetres of water is enough to make your car float. So remember, the best way for you to stay safe is to stay out of floodwaters and to follow advice from your local emergency services.
Sorry, everybody.
Yeah, next one.
Yeah, so we'll go to the next slide. So that gives you an idea of that classification scheme. And this is where we start talking a bit about the warnings. How do we get these forecasts and consequence descriptions and strategies out to the public? The Bureau predicts the height of particular points, the gauges. I suppose even for dam emergencies, because the Bureau talks to the dam owners about what the effect will be, the weather plus the dam conditions, what are the likely downstream effects. what we do in our warning message, we translate into horizontal. What does it mean around that gauge area? Because we don't have gauges at every single point in the river. There's limited gauges. And there'll be various residential infrastructure, nursing homes, schools and businesses, and there's different strategies. Like here in New South Wales, we close schools early. We don't take the risk. They're highly risk averse. Nursing homes are more complicated because we don't want to induce death unnecessarily by evacuating. The physical act of moving patients under critical care can result in some deaths. There could be natural causes, but you wouldn't close down a nursing home too early, but you warn them early. And then the Australian warning system, which I think is
I mentioned too, we have intelligence systems, which we're going to talk about very, very briefly.
Yeah.
That has all that in there as well. And obviously our plans detail that. It's not just a paper document. We have various tools to do that. And our plans talk about this, which Peter's going to talk about is this is the most challenging bit.
Yeah, we're talking about different pieces of the puzzle here.
Yeah.
The evacuation planning, which we do of, and we also do evacuation modelling for the Hawke's and Nepean and soon for other river systems. We use agent-based models where we look at the flood effects, the areas where the roads get cut, use a traffic model because it's mainly by vehicle. How long does it take? Where are the bottlenecks? And we do that across quite a different current and future scenarios. In effect, Monte Carloing the evacuation. Monte Carlo, the flood studies, Monte Carlo, the evacuation scenarios. And that's a big data piece of work. And for the last 10 years, we've been doing for the Hawke's and Nepean, and now we're expanding. Yeah. So the key things is what time must it commence? How much time will the evacuation take? That comes from modelling, either from simple models or the agent-based models. What are the steps involved? How much time do we have? What if we run out of time? How do we make more time? Well, basically, that's better forecasting. But we had a recent report by ARC, a consultancy, reviewing everything that's been done for the Hawke's and Nepean, and we've reached the limited number of gauges, forecasting, dam modelling, flood forecasting. We're at the limit. We can't do much more. That can be variable across the state, but for there, and people talk about machine learning models. That's still in its infancy and the efficacy of those. Some people who should know better talk about quantum computing, which is irrelevant because the algorithms aren't quantum algorithms. They're hydrodynamic equations we are solving. And that's where quantum doesn't affect. But there's lots of talk about that, but there's steps where we can't do more and we can't extend. We've got a probabilistic forecasting system that tries to peer in the future. We can quantify the uncertainty, but what we can't do is extend the amount of certain time frame. And that's you've got to be careful that because of that development pressures, if we could say, well, we can peer 24 hours into the future with certainty, we can do it 15 hours now, but if we do 24, we'd say that's 9 hours extra for the community. Developers say that's more opportunity to put properties in, we'll soak up that capacity. And then you're back to square one. So there's a flip side to a lot of these strategies. And go to the next slide. And engaging with the community, the behaviour change, which we won't talk about there, but there's a range of strategies. Knowing the communities, connecting and dealing with the community networks. Because in the end, after we build the gauges, do the forecasting, map out the consequences, do all the warning systems, in the end, it's people behaviour. They've got to do what we've told them to do. And that is notoriously hard. And as humans, we distort risk, we invert risk, We rationalise it away. There's all sorts of reasons. People have different forms of rationality that they're conforming to. That to other audiences may make sense, but it makes sense to them. Shifting them outside of all those frameworks they're thinking in can be very hard. So building up the community networks and interfacing with those, that's long, hard work. What doesn't work is broad scale campaigns by the moment on their own. At the other end of the scale, trying to engage with every single person in the floodplain doesn't work because we don't have enough resources to do that, ever. The Hawke's Nepean is about 150,000 people. You can't engage with all of them. And modern life is a whole range of agencies and organisations that want to engage with us, including advertisers and everybody else. Governments.
And insurers, actually, which
Insurers,
you're probably familiar with as well. So,
yeah.
It's related to that insurance, I think.
Yeah. So in modern life, you've been bombarded with so many different things. But we've got to find those middle strategies that amplify through networks and over a period of time, through a whole lot of long campaigns to modify behaviour. But along the way, there'll be lots of complaints. People will say, we weren't warned. They were.
And we know that, you know, the Sendai framework right down to all the, you know, the national plans and then the state plans and local plans is local input is critical in any plan. You must have that local input, not just input, local ownership actually of the plan.
Yeah.
That's absolutely critical.
Mm.
Yeah, so, yeah.
This morning we had a discussion on women and people with disabilities. I asked a question on how the local communities or the local authorities deal with people who maybe the deaf or the blind or the disabled when there's 40 centimeters of water, they can't get out in their wheelchair. How do you sensitize these community or these authorities to deal with this kind of issues?
Well, there's no central database of who those people are. Many people have wished for it, but it doesn't exist because there's health systems. There's a whole range of systems that, but you know, not all that data is centralised, and you know, maybe it shouldn't, you know, because it depends on your views of how much government should know about our lives. I suppose the strategy that we have to help your neighbours. If you know about those people, help them. There's also the New South Wales Ambulance Service that can provide that more intensive care to move people. So that's part of the liaison officers we have there. People who don't have vehicles, which is actually a fairly small percentage in New South Wales because we're so car dominated. There's buses for nursing homes. You know, that's where we work closely with New South Wales Ambulance Service. For a lot of disadvantaged groups, for a whole range of reasons, they don't have cars or, you know, a whole range of issues. There's local transport networks, and for example, in the Hawke's Nepean, we've hooked into that so that they're part of that transport network and they're hooked into identify a problem because they know where a lot of these people live because they transport them every day. So it's a mixture of strategies, but there's no one agency that keeps track of it all. And there's some people who like living off the grid. They don't want the government or anyone else to help them. We've got some social programs to do that, but we've got to do it in a sensitive way because we don't want to say, we're from the government, we want to help you, because some people don't want that.
Same with Indigenous communities too, like we, in the floods out in our western part of the state, Indigenous communities were, you know, didn't want to leave their communities, they didn't want to go. So how we try and deal with that is have Aboriginal liaison officers or have Aboriginal or Indigenous persons in our units, in our teams, so they can go out there because they won't listen to a uniform. They'll just go, no, we're not going to do it. So there's those kind of things as well. And if you hark back to some of those classifications of communities too, if we know from a planning perspective what the overland escape routes are versus a road escape route, that can also help. But it's it's a really hard, resource intensive.
Yeah.
Part of emergency management.
Yeah.
To get across that, so yeah.
And I guess it's about communicating with the community before a flood happens and getting them to do their own plans. So I think we have, we have resources on our side about doing your own home or business emergency plan. So it's making people think about their own circumstance before a flood happens so that they can prepare and be ready and understand when it floods. You know, if I have mobility issues, recognize that if the first warning comes out, what they need to do themselves as well, when they first hear the warnings, or what they can do, or who they can get to, you know, help them get moved, you know, before the flood actually happens. So it's about making individual people recognize their own circumstances and what they need to do if, you know, the flood was to eventuate.
Yeah, never underestimate this cohort here. They have sort of like, I've done a fair bit of work in that tsunami space and India as well. And is that those people there can really guide the adults as well. And absolutely village elders, you know, working with them, having your signposts in various languages. So, and I know there's a lot of languages in India, isn't there? So they're having those simple techniques and just have simple drills, you know, simple exercises, you know, from schools, that kind of stuff. It's and having those interactive maps available either on a device or, you know, in a placed to a tree or whatever in the local community hall. Those kind of very simple things as well, and that awareness. But it's a resource intensive. It's hard.
Yeah. We have a link on our website there with a lot of our main resources there available in a lot of the different languages.
Yeah.
For the varying communities.
Yeah, what sir was telling was rightly true, sir. The elders, the one who are basically from that place only, their experiences are a lot more actually valuable than the new generation. So in the last 2019, actually in south part of India, so where I live there, the river passes through 3 states. So actually disaster will start from the 3 states itself.
Yeah, it's sort of
So
almost
that was
coming up. Yeah.
that was coming up. So we had a flash floods then. So we got such a heavy discharge around 600 to 800 mm in a couple of days. Rainfall was so huge that we were unable to control this flood situation. So when we asked these elder persons and religious leaders, then they said this was they had this rainfall around 80 years back.
Yeah.
So during that was we had to vacate this upstream side portion.
Tap into that knowledge, yeah, and
That's one of the sharing their senior experiences there.
share the experiences with all the community members in that village.
That works well actually.
Yeah,
for sure.
and it's a big area about community engagement, and we've got a whole branch dealing with that, and it needs more resources, more funding. It's the hardest area to get funding for because there's no visible, tangiable.
It's not a big truck or a big, you know, big pump or something. You know,
You
can't cut the ribbon. Yeah, that's right. That's true. It's true.
Yeah,
very true. But also, just on that is like I found you in Bubanishwa actually. We're doing some work then. We're looking at tsunami hazards, also informing the response strategies for tsunami, informing maybe a typhoon. You know, as well. It's a very similar maybe response strategies as well. So using that multi-hazard paradigm or thinking, like we talked about earlier, because we're all in this together. It's not just this is a fire or something or cyclone. No, it's not ours. It might be very similar. So using those similar techniques, you know, emergency management techniques.
Yeah.
But it's all about relationships. And if Craig was here, he'd talk about relationships with all the key stakeholders. That's so critical, especially these kind of people as well. So
yeah.
And
So-
recognizing what their priorities and concerns are. So the get ready animals. So it's recognizing that people won't leave without their animals. So it's incorporating that into planning and, you know, like community engagement.
And we've got a lot more work to do there, and to get more staff and better programs, better targeted programs built into community networks. Because in that expenditure, you know, more response and recovery, we're spending millions on better gauges, warning systems, different languages, all the rest of it. But we need to spend a lot more money in all those varied programs, but not avert, you know, we're telling you to do this. We have to persuade them. We have to shift mindsets.
and on that, Peter, in Australian society, often, emergency services with a uniform will knock on their door and say, can you please leave? We need to go. Here's evacuation order, you need to go. Sometimes they'll go, thank you very much. I need to check either the veracity of the warning, check with my mates, my friends, my family. And then there's a lag factor if they do believe it. Then there's a lag factor of gathering all their things. But also in Australian society, there's this sort of societal sort of aspect, cultural thing. We do have a bit of adversity to authority and say, well, I'll make my own mind up whether I go or not. I might stay here and watch the water. Then only when they see the water or they see the fire, then they'll go, sorry, that's too late. Too late. Your evacuation route's cut. And then you're in trouble because you're in that low flood island. You might be in a low flood island situation. Sorry, you can't get out if the water keeps going. It's okay if it doesn't get to their house, but if it keeps going up, and we know in a lot of areas it goes way above their roofs, that's in a rescue situation. 2 o'clock in the morning, it's blowing a gale. No helicopter pilot's going to get up in the air and save you. And that's the issue. That happened in Lismore. That actually happened a year ago. People were waiting on a wet roof, thin roof, for rescue for hours and hours and hours. Very, very scary. So that's the situation we're trying to work with other agencies, including councils, land use planning, and all that, to try and get our message across these. It's a challenge.
So we'll just and there's a number of various guides which will.
We can hand out this presentation later, so you can have a look at some of those links yourself.
Yeah, but we might move on to over to Donna.
Yeah, we've only got 20 minutes. Do you want? Will we still race through?
Do you want to show the horse repair? That's a really good video.
Yeah,
just
we show that in the
engagement.
Australian warning
Just
system.
people want to get it. I don't know. What do you think? Is it worth getting a couple of minutes on that? Or-
We've got about 15, 20 minutes. Yeah.
All right. This is a really good video. This is like a suite of videos that we've got from the community.
We've just given the orders to evacuate well before the floodwater reaches
The area that Peter's been talking about.
I've seen firsthand the devastation flooding can have on our communities.
Did you know just 15 centimetres of water can start to float a small car?
Believe me, you don't want to touch this floodwater. It's a nasty soup of mud and silt, contaminated with chemicals and sewage overflow.
Floodwater also floats dangerous debris and objects. We don't want to be in it. If the floodwater gets inside your home, your carpets and flooring can't be saved. As the water level rises, your furniture and appliances will be waterlogged and ruined.
If there's 1 metre difference between floodwater inside and outside a house, immense pressures can cause buildings to fail. Flooding in the Hawkesbury Nepean Valley can be much deeper than other parts of Australia.
We know that in the worst flood on record, water would have reached this high on many houses in the valley. In some areas, houses would have been submerged by more than 2 extra metres of water. You might be surprised, but floods can get much bigger than this.
Neighbourhoods can be many weeks without power and even clean drinking water. Some parts of the floodplain can be many months before you can return to your home. That's why it's so important to be prepared and to follow evacuation warnings and orders.
It will flood again in the Hawkesbury Nepean Valley. That's a fact. Do you know your flood risk?
Got impact, hasn't it? So we've got a suite of those kind of videos to really bring home that message. We're talking to people who have actually been in the flood before. Yep, that's it. Who have actually been in a flood before, who didn't evacuate, and then they've been interviewed, the Vox Pop, and they said, well, why didn't you? I didn't know the risk, didn't understand. But now I do, that, and getting maybe that message across too. And that getting that local messaging out there is really important if you can.
And maybe related to the communication that you mentioned, I wonder when is the first stage that we know that it's going to be a flood? How do you communicate? Like, what is the communication flow and what type of communication tools that are being used, or probably you will present it later?
Good question.
So, the New South Wales SES, we issue warning products in line with the Australian warning system. That's a national framework that's came on board a number of years ago now, and right across Australia. This system provides a greater clarity to communities when warning about imminent impacts of flood storms and tsunami, and it leads to a greater community understanding and action. So there's been a lot of research done into the visuals and the language used, and a lot of community research and community consultation has gone into the developing the system. And what's good, it aligns with all other emergency service organisations within New South Wales and across Australia. So as you travel around Australia, people are familiar with the way the warnings are presented, how they come out. And it also ensures that the SES meets legislative requirements under our Act. And it also addresses some recommendations that have come out of operational reviews, where there's been a need to improve some of our warnings. So there's a quick little video, now that I'm an expert at doing this.
Our warning system is changing. I'm Lacey from Lismore Unit, and in this video, Michael and I will be taking you through those changes.
Our new warnings align to the Australian warning system, which has 3 levels. You will see these 3 coloured icons in all of our warning products during floods. These are also the icons for storms and tsunamis. Other agencies across Australia will also use similar icons for other hazards like bushfires and cyclones.
Where you may have previously seen warnings like minor flood bulletin, major flood bulletin, or evacuation warning, these will now be simplified into these 3 warning levels. There are 3 elements to each warning.
A location and hazard which outlines the type of hazard impacting the community and where it is occurring. An action statement to guide positive actions by the community, and the warning level indicating the severity of the hazard.
With the Australian warning system, we will now have greater flexibility to issue warnings at the community level rather than at the catchment level. This means we can provide more relevant and localised information to impacted communities. As the rain starts to fall and floodwaters rise, the New South Wales SES will issue warnings based on the level of risk and expected consequence to the community.
If we receive information from the Bureau of Meteorology that minor flooding is expected or a flood watch is issued, we may issue an advice level warning. If floodwaters are expected to be moderate or major, we may issue a watch and act warning. If a community is likely to be significantly impacted by these floodwaters and we need to evacuate people, we will issue an emergency warning.
Our new warnings framework provides greater flexibility, so we can issue warnings separate to the Bureau of Meteorology depending on the expected consequence. Follow the actions in the warning, which may include stay informed, prepare to evacuate, or move to higher ground.
Along with our new warnings, we are working with the New South Wales Department of Customer Service to develop a national multi-hazard warning platform called Hazard Watch. This platform will show all New South Wales SES warnings and provide another way for the community to access this important information. You can access Hazard Watch at hazardwatch.gov.au. Understand what these warnings mean for your communities. To learn more, visit the warning page on My SES, speak to your unit commander or zone team, or email warnings.capability@ses.nsw.gov.au.
Together, we can save lives and create safer communities.
Of course, that was for our internal guys for that, but they've taken part of this to give it to the community as well. So to answer your question maybe directly, is that advice level first up, and to say it may flood. These are the things you can do to prepare and be prepared to watch media, watch, be quite vigilant on you might receive another kind of warning. Sorry.
No, you're right. Yeah, so that, yeah, as the video pointed out, there's 3 different warning levels, and what's similar across the whole national framework is these icons here, and then the colouring. So advice being yellow, then watch and act being orange, and then the emergency warning, the red one. So I'm going to do that.
The presentation.
So as a flood progresses and the consequences increase, that's when we move up through the warning products. So yeah, starting down, there's a low level flooding expected, some agricultural land impact that we did send out an advice, so that it'd move up to watch and act as things were starting to escalate, and followed by the emergency warning. And then at the end, once a flood has peaked and things are settling down, we actually then also have a de-escalation. So we'd go back to, we always finish up with an advice product at the end. So I mentioned in the video the action statements. So these have been developed. A lot of research has also gone into that and testing them on actual community members. It's really what the action we want the community to take. So they're very specific, short and sharp. But as you can see from the advice level, we've just got the stay informed and monitor conditions. And this would be the de-escalation one. And then as we go up, it progresses up to evacuate now or before a particular time frame. So we've mapped, I think so we mapped that out also, that's for tsunami. With tsunami, you'll notice there's nothing in the middle. That's on purpose. We don't want a watch and act for tsunami.
It happens too quickly. You don't get 4 hours notice or something like that.
And also we don't want people to go down to the beach to watch. That misconception there. So that's why that's been taken out, and de-escalation, return with caution. And then we're soon to move over to bring the severe weather across. That starts actually next week, moving over to the platform. So here we've got the action statements for those levels as well. So there's 3 core components to the Australian warning system, and along with the triangle icons and the colouring system. And this makes up like an action statement. So this is what's uniform across Australia. So yeah, location hazards such as Lismore is flooding. An action statement, like I just showed on the slides before, and then the warning level. The actual body of the warning, that's more up to the discretion of the particular emergency service agency. So yeah, you can put in whatever you want there. It's just more of the headline and the way it looks, and all of these 4 components, which is uniform across Australia. So the way we disseminate our warnings, we've got a number of options. We've got our SES website, Hazards Watch and Hazards Near Me app. I'll go through in a minute. Then we've also got these other ones like door knocking, emergency alert, and a lot of our planning that we've already previously done, and we've formed those sectors based on what's going to happen with that community. Then we can send out an emergency alert to that sector that we've already pre-created. And then we've also got community meetings, broadcasts, media, or when a warning product is produced, our system also distributes to a set list of people that would have it, mainly like the media outlets and particular stakeholders. So I'll go on to just show you Hazard. Okay, well, this is Hazard Watch. At the moment, the live version, which I'll leave the link in that presentation so you can actually go on and see it yourself. There's only one little warning at the moment, so there's not much there to look at. But this is what it looks like, and people can go right in and actually zoom right into where they actually live. They can also, you can set up like a watch zone. So if something happens in your watch zone and something gets published, you'll get the alert on your phone as well. And then you can click on the warning and it will bring it up here, and it'll actually bring up the actual warning in more detail. So which is the next slide. Yeah, so then you can bring it up and you can actually see, it'll go into what's happening, what you need to do, and then where you can go for further information. Yeah, so that came on board a while ago, and there's also other agencies, the fires, the RFS, they produce their warning, they put their warning products onto here as well. This is what it looked like in the 2022 floods. So this was when a large portion of New South Wales was in flood, and it looked like this for quite a long period of time. There was warnings
La
constantly.
Nina, we had a lot of these in major floods, all these are red, these catchments, and you can see how much red is in there. So they're all communities subject to evacuation.
Do you work with dam owners on evaluating flood events? They may not do pre-releases because if it's a water supply dam, they obviously want to keep as much water as possible, or a hydro dam. And then often we work in Chennai, we saw this in 2015 where they kept all the water, and then when it's too late, massive flooding.
Yep.
Last December, they did already much better. They did pre-releases, so they had a bit of buffer in their reservoir.
Yeah.
But flooding occurs much further downstream, maybe, which you notice they may not be fully aware of it. So do you evaluate this kind of event?
Yes, we work closely with the dam owners and the bureau. Basically, if there's a heads up of some, a large amount of weather covered, they may do a pre-release, but it's all discussions. There's a meeting set up and it's all talked through. The bureau will, if we know how much has been released, the bureau factor that into their flood modelling, so they can then let us know what will there be the downstream consequences. So it's all done.
Yeah, definitely have SES as a key stakeholder in those meetings. So you'd have as part of the operations, we'd have a meeting. Let's say there might be a dam owner, SES, dam safety, maybe in that meeting, and that meeting will then determine, let's say Water New South Wales will determine what those pre-releases might be to maintain that airspace or whatever that is. To then, and we had very many scenarios. Nindi Lakes was a case in point here about releasing at a certain rate, so much gigalitres per day, to maintain the integrity of the structure, but also not to overwhelm the downstream community of the township of Nindi, for example, so they're not in major flooding or what have you. So it's a balance, but it's definitely part of the operation to actually do that.
Yeah, because if it doesn't happen, you're the bad boy or girl.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So who's the main decision maker? Is it important in South Wales?
Wow. Peter, you want to answer that one?
Yeah, it gets a little bit complicated depending on the dam. The Warragamba Dam for Sydney, by law, it's not a flood mitigation dam, so they're not allowed to do pre-release and so forth. We've explored a lot of strategies there, but it impacts upstream, the water supply. Those scenarios are best done beforehand to a lot of Monte Carlo modelling. There was a big court case in Brisbane, in Queensland, Wivenhoe Dam, where they were trying to balance up water supply and flood mitigation. They were following a manual, and there was two major court cases in the end, which were trying to blame the engineers. And then you had barristers involved trying to pick apart manuals, even to the extent where they said, barristers said there's too much interpretation with graphs, don't use graphs, just use text. Now that's dumb, but that's how lawyers view the world. Engineers use diagrams and equations and so forth. That's having a bit on a flow-on effect. That pre-release strategies, modifying the flow as it's happening is fraught with difficulty. And with Wivenhoe, those cases went on for years. With Warragamba Dam, a lot of people say do something. One event, the previous government tried to do something, but they were very heavily don't, because of unintended consequences, because you're making decisions on the run. In some of these rural dams or whatever, there could be some discussion, because they're flood mitigation dams. It's an area that we actually need to get better at in defining what's the envelope of scenarios here, so that we're not just flying by the seat of our pants. Because you're talking about compressed timescales. Some people try to do models in their heads. Other people are trying to find manuals. It's something we need to be much more quantitative in research. So in the end, I suppose we're the ones, there'll be two competing objectives. We're trying to protect the downstream population, and dam owners will be trying to protect the dam. and there's a crossover
I
there
think
with
to-
this discussion.
I think, Peter,
Yeah.
probably the one that wins out, I would imagine, would be protecting the structure. Because if that structure then failed catastrophically, there'd be a worse
Yeah.
flood anyway.
Yeah.
You know, I would say, but we haven't been in that situation yet.
Yeah,
So we need to improve that.
luckily we don't go there often, but out in these country areas, it comes up more than in the coastal areas. But we need to be much better at modelling the scenarios. So we're making informed decisions based on models rather than off the cuff discussions on gut feel. That's where mistakes can be made and the criticism flows. But the Wivenhoe case has made it more difficult, I suppose, like in Warragamba Dam, you know, if it ever became a flood mitigation dam, there'll be even more extensive modelling to try and avoid those kind of court cases. And in fact, most dams now built, well, the few dams that are built are not gated dams. That's a gated dam. So a future dam would be designed so it progressively reduces water. There's no human intervention. That's better because as soon as there's human intervention, people will argue about it. So it's a difficult area. Hopefully we don't cross too often, but more modelling. Yeah, maybe that's a future in dam safety. Dam safety New South Wales and themselves. Let's explore that space in a much better way.
To make it more quantitative, but it still is going to be dependent on those relationships and that discussion with other agencies.
There's always trade-offs.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's often, and there's complex trade-offs. And you shouldn't do them on the run. That's when mistakes can be made, when you've got hours to decide.
A big part of our business is if we can do this in the quiet time when it's not flooding. So you do that scenario modelling in the quiet time, then if it gets to this much, okay, we need to release it 70 gigalitres per day. What's that going to do? Blah, blah, blah. Then we've got maybe some quantitative strategies there that are best, like the best of the, based on the best available information we've got at the time.
Yeah.
So is transparency around those trade-offs an important part of how you operate? I mean,
it's
documented.
Increasingly, we're going to have to do that. We're going to have to.
Because from a legal perspective, in some sense, all you can do is just be transparent.
Yeah.
And be important, and that's really important too, because it's important to say to the public, and our commissioners will say that sometimes. You'll see that in Queensland as well, the cyclones. If we don't know what we don't know. Tell the public what we actually don't know and what we don't know is forecasted or predicted. So the community understand where we're coming from as well. And we're not setting ourselves up for to keep something secret from the public. All our the research and in the community engagement space and the media space as well is to give the public the bitter pill, if that's not a good term, but tell them early what their risk is going to be, even if we don't know what the worst risk is going to be. But we need to say that we don't necessarily know that. That's based on best research. All right. So,
You're happy?
Happy to wrap up?
Yeah.
I'm sure if you, so can we please thank the team from the SES for their presentation?
We'll see that, especially the interaction between the dams and some of the tools that we use, such as intelligence, our GIS systems, and our dashboards on looking at rapid data assessment.
So I'm not sure, Basant, whether or not we're going to consolidate all this material.
That's
a pack for everyone. But so no, thank you for your time. If you can stay for a cup of tea.
Yeah, I'd love to.
There's an opportunity for you to ask any further questions. So please.
Just want some closing back. We've covered a lot of territory here. This is a big, complicated area, lots of different facets and dimensions. What we're trying to do is improve in various dimensions. We know they're all interconnected, but we can't be trapped into the interconnectedness of it. We've got to decompose it to some extent and extend in different areas, and then always be conscious of that. We've got a broad range of teams now. It takes a lot of people to do this work across agencies within the agencies, including into human behaviour. So hopefully we're giving you some idea of the complexity some of the idea of the strategies. We could go for hours or days talking about this stuff.
Yeah, we can if you
yeah.
want.
Yeah, but it's